Hi, everyone. My name is Wes Robertson, and I am a senior lecturer in Japanese studies at Macquarie University. This is a re-recording of a lecture I recently gave at Macalester College on graphic ideologies and language reform in the Japan Times. Now, I know nothing about video editing whatsoever, so I'm just going to try to do this in one take. Please forgive any flubs or failures, etc. But I hope you find this interesting. I wasn't able to open up that presentation to the wider audience, so I'm sure that there are people out there that are interested in this kind of topic, and I thought it'd be good to be able to, put it out so that everyone who wants to could have access to it. So with that said, let's begin. So as mentioned today, I'm going to be talking about graphic ideologies and language reform within the newspaper, the Japan Times. Now, this means, of course, that before I can get into any of the data, there are kind of three background issues that I am going to have to go over to make sure that anyone watching this presentation can kind of follow along. And this is first, what is a graphic ideology? Second, why is it important to Japanese context? And three, why the Japan Times as a data source? To give this kind of background, let's just start by talking about language ideologies, of which graphic ideologies are, of course, a subset. So language ideologies are our beliefs about who uses or should use or should not use which forms of language and why. To quote people who are way more famous than I will ever be, beliefs about language articulated by users as a rationalization or justification of perceived language structure and use, the cultural systems of ideas about social and linguistic relationships together with their loading of moral and political interests, and just our beliefs or feelings about language. Now, this is things like politeness, for instance. What is polite? Why is it polite? In what context is it polite? What is rude? Who should speak which ways? What way men should speak? Which way women should speak? All these ideas are graphic ideologies. They are the things that make us understand what language means in ways that can't be understood if you just read language on the page. It goes beyond kind of the formal rules that you might associate with, basic kind of introductory linguistics, going beyond just like phonetics or grammar, and more into the cultural understandings of language, the individual understandings of language that influence how we interpret language acts in the context they appear, and what we believe those acts say about people and their users, or why we use them to say things about ourselves. So language ideology research has been quite important, specifically in the Japanese context as well. There are books like Japanese Language, Gender, and Ideology, which is a great collection of works on ideology and language in Japan. There's been a lot of research on language and gender in Japan, as Japanese, of course, has social beliefs about how men and women should speak. Looking at the history of these beliefs has also been a very, very interesting data set. And there's been even some really recent research recently on how these beliefs are influencing representations of non-native Japanese speech in Japanese text. So using this topic of language ideology within the Japanese context is nothing new. Graphic ideologies then are our beliefs about who uses or should use which forms of language restricted to the written mode and why. This is a term that was developed by Silverstein, and it's basically if you read a text and in doing so, you encounter something that would be lost if you read the text out loud, something like font, something like Spitzmüller talks about the umlauts used in the metal scene that don't actually affect pronunciation on a band's name like Motorhead. It's not Muterhead. Those kind of things are what we can have graphic ideologies about. So these are obviously less common and less discussed in day-to-day life than language ideologies. You hear people talking about what an accent means or why what someone said was rude much more commonly than you hear them talking about the way that people write, but they absolutely do exist. For instance, this was the first slide of my presentation. Oh, sorry. Oh, there you go. But now imagine if it had looked like this. Now, for some of you, you wouldn't care. But for some of you, you may have immediately assumed that, okay, this is not a video I'm going to take seriously. This person is not an academic that I can take seriously. Our associations with this font, which is, of course, Comic Sans, are maybe not as vivid as our associations with certain accents or particular vocabulary words, forms of slang, subcultural sayings, but they are vivid enough to have perhaps exclude something like a serious academic. And indeed, the existence of discussions, linguistic discussions about what Comic Sans implies about someone or what it means are common enough that, I mean, the font has its own opposition section on Wikipedia, and there are tons of articles about, how Comic Sans is bad. But what if I'd use this font? Now, again, you may not associate this with academia, but you may have a different set of associations on who the author of this, the designer of this slide might be compared to Comic Sans. And for both of these, though, they wouldn't actually change the content of what I've written, right? The meaning is still the same. The words are still the same. The grammar is still the same. The literal meaning doesn't change, but the associations, that you link to the identity of the creator might. And if you've seen any of my presentations ever before, you probably have seen me use this slide, so apologies for going over it again, but I just think this is a fantastic example of how ideologies of gender can appear even in like the English context where the writing system is not as complex as Japanese. These two books, there's a lot we could say, but just looking at things that are lost if we read the text out loud, you can see how the Brainy Book for Boys, the font is in all caps. The kerning, or the way that the letters are positioned, is terrible. Like on the I don't know about this dude in the second book there, the D's are all like, one is down and slanted, some are tiny and jammed together, nothing's on a straight line. And like in the word boys and for, you can see that the font has like holes cut out of it, like with a pick. In contrast, in the Brainy Book for Girls, you see everything on a straight line. It's in a cursive font, and the I's are dotted with little asterisks. You can see these kind of ideologies, right? These beliefs that different ways of writing represent boyness and girlness manifested in the different ways that these are designed. Now, this is especially important within the Japanese writing system because I'm sure many of you already know this, but if you don't, the Japanese writing system uses multiple scripts together. So in a simple sentence like this, which translates as I drank coffee, we can see the three main scripts, kanji, hiragana, and katakana, being used together. Kanji here is stereotypically normally used for nouns from Japanese and Chinese and the non-inflectional stems of adjectives and verbs. So here it's representing the word I, watashi, and the no in the verb nomimashita, which is the stem of to drink. You could perhaps think of this as the dr in drink, so the part that doesn't change if you go to drank or drunk. Then here we have hiragana, which is a phonetic script, which is used primarily for grammatical purposes. Wa and o are grammatical particles, which is an element of Japanese grammar. And then mimashita is telling us that the verb drink is in the polite past tense. So drank and implications of polite rather than a more casual or super polite speech form. And then katakana is another phonetic script used primarily for loanwords. Kohi here is, of course, a loanword coming from coffee. And the Roman alphabet, also known as Romaji, is also used as well. So there's a lot of variety and diversity that you can involve in this because, these rules exist, these norms exist, but you can vary the way that you represent script. However, these norms are actually kind of new in the history of Japanese writing. Certainly, they're very new. Arguably, you could say that the standards for writing Japanese that we know now are less than 100 years old, being finalized around 1950. But in reality, you could maybe go back to 1850 before there was kind of a countrywide norm being built. Before the 1800s especially, the way the Japanese was written depended a lot on your education level, your class, what style of writing you were doing, what you were writing for, who you were writing to, your gender, your education, all these factors. There were multiple competing ways of writing Japanese that circulated throughout the nation, which again, nation being a concept that in the 1600s, 1500s meant a lot different than what we would say today. There was not a single way of writing Japanese that was universal across the country. In reality, debates over how the need to have a singular writing style for the entirety of Japan really only picked off about 1850 into 1950. Now, the history of this has been well documented. I don't have anything new to contribute to that actual literal history, the literal events. I especially recommend the works of Nanette Gottlieb. They're very easy to read for academic writing, and she's written a huge amount and that goes into detail about this history extensively. But the ideologies which surrounded these debates over writing system have not really been discussed. We know they exist because there's hints of them in writing that's come to date. Nanette Gottlieb's work on the Romaji movement, for instance, notes that one person who was pro the removal of kanji thought that the backwardness in Japanese culture was caused by the script. And in kanji politics, Gottlieb notes the very, very commonly noted belief of more conservative voices in the Japanese government who were in charge and kind of had power until basically 1950, that young people would be cut off from access to national values and heritage if they were not educated to read the current writing system. So kanji not just being useful or good for Japanese, but something which connects you to the values of Japan. That is the ideological part. So my goal with this presentation then is to look more at these ideologies that surrounded the debate, to see how the debate was not just a debate over like literally which way works best for writing Japanese, but more a debate over values and identity. To do so, I'm going to be drawing my data from the Japan Times. So let's finish this introduction by talking about why I chose that data source. So the Japan Times is a particularly important and interesting element of the history of journalism in Japan. Modern Japanese journalism can be said to begin at the end of the Edo period, so around the 1860s. Now, there was, of course, things that you could consider journalism before that. Kawarabon, for instance, this is an example of these kind of digest papers. There wasn't no one investigating or reporting on anything for sure. But what we would think of today as a contemporary newspaper first came out in the early 1860s. This is the Nagasaki Shipping List and Advertiser, which was published in 1861. And this is generally thought to be the first newspaper that existed in Japan in the contemporary sense of the term. Indeed, English language newspapers published by non-Japanese individuals there was quite a boom in the late 1800s. These were all run by British, Portuguese, or American nationals. And while they fought over a very small readership, some, like the Kobe Chronicle, eventually the Japan Chronicle, did have a bit of influence. Do note the Japan Times in 1965 is a different Japan Times, although it was eventually absorbed by the Japan Times that I'm talking about today. But they were influential in the history of Japanese journalism in that they created models for the Japanese newspapers that came out around 1963, 1964. And also they served as a source of news about the world outside of Japan, with some of their articles being translated into Japanese for publication in these Japanese newspapers. So in terms of readership, minimal, very, very not even remotely comparable to the Japanese newspapers that came out. And of course, that also stimulated this debate over how we need to have a single way to write Japanese because the newspapers want to be read across the country. But they were influential in just the history of Japanese journalism itself. Now, the Japan Times came out at the tail end of all of this. This is the first issue of the Japan Times, and it was published in 1897. It was distinct from all the English language journalism before, though, in that it was run by two Japanese individuals initially. Now, this meant that it was distinct from the English language journalism and being very, very much more pro-Japan, but it was distinct from a lot of the Japanese-owned press in being more international. And this sort of balance of internationalism and nationalism, this kind of tricky tightrope that it's trying to walk, is present immediately from the first editorial, which you can see here, published in the first issue. It starts by talking about it being a remarkable and deplorable fact that after 40 years of mutual association, His Majesty's subjects and the foreign residents of Japan remain to this day virtual strangers of each other. However, Japanese sentiments and motives should be rightly presented. And because in the eyes of the general public abroad, Japan is like a dumb actress, leaving the audience to attach to emotions whatever meaning it may please them to choose. So there needs to be better communication, but the Japanese interests need to be presented properly. Going on to claim that while the English language newspapers have done a lot of work in helping information about Japan be promulgated outside of Japan, it is only by the Japanese themselves that their views, sentiments, and aspirations can be correctly presented to the outside world. So this means the Japan Times has a very unique place in Japanese journalism. It's the only English language paper with 100 years of history. It is the first English language paper published by Japanese nationals. It has a long history which includes both direct Japanese and US government control and censorship. In the run-up to World War II, it was actually forced to change its name to the Nippon Times. And after World War II, it was directly censored by the American government and published for American troops. It had its highest circulation until the internet age after World War II because it was the primary paper in Japan that was given to the American servicemen in the country at the time. So this has an audience, therefore, that is not only more internationally minded than the average Japanese paper broadly, but also one that's incredibly volatile, actively reacting to changes in the surrounding historical context. So while any Japanese newspaper could be a source of graphic ideologies about writing, debate, and reform, I thought that the Japan Times especially would be a productive data source in not only having a long history, but also having a wide variety of voices that might not be able to encounter within the Japanese context. I'm sure any paper could have voices that say, for instance, kanji are very Japanese, but I thought this would have more of a variety of these kind of voices, and perhaps even more frequently, as of course it was positioned in a way that wanted to increase communication with the West, perhaps more than some Japanese papers editors would. So with that said, let's get into the data. And I'm going to break this down across periods, taking the Showa period and breaking it in half, both pre and post World War II. So late Meiji, from the start of the publication of this paper till 1912. Overall, there were 61 articles across this time period which discussed the Japanese writing system and the need for reform. 26 are general reports, 16 are editorials, 14 are discussions of a scholar, and 6 are letters to the editor. Now, these are not hard divides, especially this early period. A lot of reports have an editorial bent to them. Like they'll say this happened and it was good, or this happened and we hope it doesn't happen again, or we hope it is overturned. But as a broad kind of comparison, and also a broad way of looking at how script is discussed, I think it's quite useful. Also, I should note, though, that during this period, script reform is tied up with discussions of education reform, as Japan was in the process of reforming its entire education system. So claims like the so-called Chinese scholars of a present time seem, as a rule, incapable of understanding the new spirit of the times, being supremely contented with the narrow, old-fashioned ideas of bygone ages, or even claims that the classics of Japan and China have nothing in them worth considering, are only found in this time as they're trying to kind of get away with the use of classics as a form of education. Early, the Japan Times takes a pro-reform and generally pro-Romanization stance. For instance, only one of the 14 scholars they discuss are pro-kanji. So promotion by omission or presenting an opinion by omitting opinions you don't agree with is a strategy that appears quite often and runs throughout the paper's history. That said, they are sometimes not consistent on what side they take. So, for instance, here they say that people are unanimous in declaring the advisability of adopting Roman characters as substitutes for the Chinese. But 3 years later, they say that they have always been in favor of the exclusive use of kana, so hiragana and katakana with no kanji. And then 3 years later, they claim that while the national spirit appears to the kana advocates, the utilitarian principle weighs more with Romaji supporters. We side with the latter. Practical reasons are raised in this debate, of course. It's not all ideologies. Generally speaking, the main critique is that Japanese is just too hard. There are claims that reform will progress the nation. 4 claims that words with kanji sound kind of silly. And then 3 talk about issues with technology, and 3 talk about the benefits that Romanization or removal of kanji would have to non-Japanese learners. So, for instance, here you can see the argument that Chinese ideographs, now kanji and Chinese characters are not ideographs, but that's the term that is used throughout this data set, tend to develop powers of a memory to an extent highly injurious to the proper culture of other facilities of the mind. Is this true? No, but it is presented in a way which is like, this is data for my argument. It's not like the ideological argument isn't really there. Although, I mean, you could argue it's there in the background, but it's not blatant. And you'll see that when I compare it to data later. Here again, they point out how the use of Chinese characters is, quote, acting as an impediment to the intellectual progress of the people, depending on them as their media for expressing their thoughts. The very defectiveness of the knowledge of the exact sciences in China is a convincing proof of the truth of this hypothesis. Not that the Chinese as a race have imperfect brains and are unable, even under favorable conditions, to become proficient in the exact sciences. The real reason is because such sciences cannot be taught with precision by means of Chinese characters. Again, is this true? No. You can teach science via Chinese characters. Japan itself is proving that. China is proving that. No, it is not as proving, excuse me, has long proved that. But the presentation of this argument is that Chinese characters prevent the ability to teach science. So it doesn't have to be true, but it is presented in a way which is practical. It's presented as though it is a true data-proven argument. In contrast, though, we see ideologies used to frame reformists as certain groups of the population or certain types of people. That is, those who don't like kanji, those who support Romanization are a certain type, this sort of positive identity creation. For instance, here you can see the idea that Romanization is approved of by, quote, all well-known authorities on things Japanese, or that the educated classes are unanimous in attending to the replacement of Romanization for over Chinese characters. Now, both of these are also false. The actual support for the abolition of kanji and the actual support, especially for full Romanization in Japan, was never a minority. Never a majority. It was always a very minority push, especially the total Romanization push. The only time they ever got close was when the American government was in charge after World War II. But the presentation here is that, oh, okay, if you know things, if you're intelligent, you're definitely going to be a supporter of reform. Likewise, here you can see the idea that the leaders of public opinion, also, again, not true at the time, the public was never 50% plus in favor of Romanization, are now advocating for a system that is easier to learn, which of course they go on to push for the Romaji. There are also then ideologies which frame Romaji as a modern writing system and kanji as barbaric. For instance, here in this piece, which is pro-katakana only writing, and indeed they come up with, as you can see, a katakana only system that involves kind of ad hoc capitals. They talk about how Chinese ideographs now in use belong in a childhood age, an age that all nations have passed through, but Japan has now become a man with other civilized nations, and it is high time that she put away childish things. So kanji are not just hard to learn, kanji are not just unable to teach you science, they are in fact childish, whereas Romaji is a modern adult script for a modern adult nation. The script you uses tells us what kind of nation you are. Likewise here, the argument that kana and Chinese characters keep Japan sealed within the old walls of feudalism, whereas Romaji is an enlightened system of writing, despite that, of course, Romanization or the Roman alphabet was used during feudalism in Europe, of course, or the argument that the nature worshipper, the idolater, the barbarian may still be seen in the language used by the most cultured people of Asia and the most artistic people in the modern world, but the Japanese have finally advanced beyond the Germans and are awake to the necessity of a clear, succinct language, clearly and succinctly written. So kanji is evidence of barbarism. It is evidence of nature worship, and that is not compatible with the modern age. So in the Meiji period, we see that the Japan Times is advocating for writing systems not just as practical solutions to educational issues, but as something that reflects the quality of someone or even the nation's thoughts and character. The newspaper's clear preference for Romanization as the future of a civilized Japan reminds us of the inherent multi-sidedness of where language ideologies are produced and discussed, and shows the influence of its particular audience of English readers. They are clearly engaging with ideologies that would be sympathetic to an English-speaking audience, which is, again, primarily not Japanese people at this time. And also that the ideologies that existed in Japan were far more complex than just kanji Japanese, romaji not Japanese. We're seeing a large variety of different voices being raised. However, as we'll see moving forward, although the Japan Times continues its Romanization advocacy into the Taisho era, it is forced to alter the ideologies that it uses to do so as we enter a place where socially, culturally, and politically, referring to traditional Japanese scripts as immoral or barbarous becomes untenable. So Taisho period, 1913 to 1926. We have about the same frequency of publication of discussion of script reform, and advocacy is stable. So out of the 49 articles that take a specific position, which as you can see is less than half, so 12 advocate for full Romanization, 12 talk about reducing kanji and not giving a solution for what happens next, 3 for kana only, 2 for romaji kana mixes, and 1 for just using English. This is actually something that has been noted by people like Nanette Gallia, but I did note it in my data set well, and it's always kind of fun to see that coming up. People just saying, let's just abandon Japanese. It's happened. There's even been people that argued for just changing the Japanese language to French as well in other data sets. So not popular, not common, but does exist. Practical motives are stable. For instance, impedes technology gets a little increase as people start to worry about typewriters. This person, for instance, proposes a katakana-based system that would help typewriters become easier using a modified katakana. And many ideologies are also repeated. Here, for instance, the idea that reform is that of sensible people is something that quite mirrors what we've seen before. However, there are changes, and those changes coincide with the Japan Times entering explicit government censorship. And how do we know that? Well, the Japan Times complaining about government censorship. We gave expression to government censorship, which we have not been given any reason to why that occurred. So at this time then, it is perhaps not surprising that which script is most patriotic becomes a major center of debate. So for instance, here, the argument is not that reformists are intelligent or leaders of public opinion. Rather, they are those who are built up by a patriotic aspiration. And what is that aspiration to do? To build an independent Japanese language and literature of reasonable purity, of which will dispense with the present loose adulteration of Japanese and Chinese. So here we see Chinese characters, kanji, being rejected as not Japanese for someone who is pro-reform, moving towards indigenous characters that are more Japanese. Likewise, here in 1923, we see pro-kanji pieces centering around this as well, such as the argument that the Japanese language must remain Japanese and our language our own, of which we are proud, or the argument that the classical elements of the national language are symbolic of the traditional national character, which will be absolutely impossible to symbolize via romaji. It is a very delicate problem, but not something we can argue out through simple logic. Indeed, even Romanization, though, becomes positioned as patriotic. And we can see this in debates over Romanization itself. At the time, there are 2 competing Romanization systems, the Hepburn system, which is the foundation of the modified Hepburn system we often use today, and the Nipponshiki system, or the Japanese-style system. Now, when these 2 groups are advocating for the removal of kanji, they're united, but there's a lot of clashes over which system is best. This person, for instance, who is a Japanese-style advocate, notes that our system is finding more and more supporters day by day and will replace both Japanese and Chinese characters, so here's how you can spell it. This response leads to a flurry of letters to the editor against it, which have ideologies of their own. For instance, the argument that the Nipponshiki system is pedantic, or that It is the only reason that Japanese people are against the Hepburn system is the Seiyo Gusai, or smells of the West, and therefore patriotism forbids Japanese to improve it. Approve of it. Or even here, an argument which is quite ironic, given that both parties want to destroy, or not destroy, but get rid of kanji, hiragana, and katakana. They note that actually Hepburn was based on a form created by the Romaji Kai, or the Romaji group, and therefore it is actually the origin of Japanese scholars. So our friends of today, the Nippon Shiki advocates, are trying to undo the excellent work of Japanese scholars. Is this consistent with the Japanese virtue of respect for ancestors? So the question of which Romanization system is consistent with Japanese values becomes an argument, with Romanization positioned as Japanese, an origin of Japanese scholarship. Something with its origin in Japanese scholarship. So in summary, the Taisho erographic ideologies are distinct from Meiji framings in the appearance of links between scripts and authentic Japaneseness. But while these links have been long observed in coverage of kanji advocacy, we can see here that patriotism was in fact evoked in support of all scripts, with even kanji sometimes positioned as not Japanese to support its abolition. Discussion of script reform in the Japan Times here was therefore not simply a conflict over practical issues, but a locus of social dialogues about Japaneseness and language, which cannot be understood without attending to, and therefore reflecting and shedding light on, complex systems of power and their surrounding struggles. So what happens then when we move a bit closer to World War II in the Showa period? Well, overall, we see that discussion of writing reform increases a lot, about almost 10 discussions a year. Additionally, more of these take an explicit position on writing reform. We used to have less than half, now we have over 2/3. 42 push for the reduction or abolition of kanji, 23 are full Romanization, 9 for full kana, and 39 are just debates over the best way to Romanize Japanese. So we're seeing a lot of continuations here again. Indeed, there are even little sub-debates which are interesting. At the time, the Minister of the Railway tries to flip Japanese railway signs, which had gone left to right, back to the traditional Japanese right to left. The Japan Times mocks this extensively and is very against it. This political cartoon, for instance, proposes a sign that anyone can rotate to see the script they want in the direction that they want, which is kind of a funny little idea. And of course, there are ideologies within these sub-debates, such as the idea that going from left to right would destroy tradition and therefore be detrimental to the thought of the nation, or the Japan Times responder that the right to left system is an archaic style of purism. And there are also some interesting practical proposals that I hadn't seen before, such as the idea that Japanese should be written in Sanskrit. Only one of these obviously wasn't very popular as an idea, but it's interesting to know that it existed. Somebody pushed for this. Eye fatigue also comes up as a new practical argument, such as the argument that there's scientific grounds, I don't know if this is true, but that's their claim, that reading left to right gives less fatigue to the eye, or the claim that kanji causes, at least partially, the unusual amount of visual defectiveness found in the East. Again, I do not know if there has ever been a study on which country has the highest use of glasses. I doubt they'd find much difference. But again, this is more of a practical argument, right? They are arguing that eye damage is caused by kanji, even though I find that a bit suspect. Initially, though, Romanization advocacy continues as well. They even publish a "You Can Read Japanese in Romaji" column for a few months, which attempts to show that Romanization is actually not that hard to read. I don't know if it's quite successful, but that's their goal. Indeed, for instance, in 1931, we see the idea that moderns, so bringing in that kind of ideology again, find the current Japanese writing system irrational, with the current move towards language reform having the impetus of modern civilization. However, once we hit 1936, we start to see a very, very distinct change in framing. Reform is now for the good of Japan rather than for Japan's westernization, etc. For instance, the idea that reform would help people who are uninformed of Japanese developments become acquainted with them, or even the idea that this is 1942, so like we're in direct, explicit government control at this point, but they're still pushing for a reduction of Chinese characters in order to save energy that can be helped use to forward the culture of the nation now. So you can still argue for reform, even though the government is quite against it, if you do so in a way that promotes it as for the good of Japan and the Japanese culture, rather than for a way that imposes kind of change on Japan. Indeed, Romanization framing becomes positioned as well. Romanization is now bad. You cannot argue for Romanization in the Japan Times except under very specific circumstances. So this piece from June 28th, 1936 seems to be kind of a flashpoint in the change. As you can see, the Japan Times now arguing that there's a fundamental error of the Romaji theorists that the idea that one language can be reproduced in another. They say that's impossible. This article here, then, you can see from 1942 that after 1936, Romanization advocacy only becomes tenable when it is done in a way which is outside Japan and promotes ideologies which center around Japan being the soul of Asia itself. So this piece here is pro-Romaji, but pro-Romaji in Burma, so that the Burmese can, quote, grasp the true Asiatic spirit, the introduction of Japanese culture, literature, and art being the first step towards the attainment of this object. So Romanization advocacy is basically gone after 1936, but does appear slightly outside of Japan, but in ways that reinforce this belief that the Japanese language is in fact the soul of Asia itself. Kana advocacy, though, replaces Romanization advocacy. So the Japan Times does still advocate for the reduction of kanji, but moving to pro-kana, going from just 4 before 1937 to 5 between 1941 and 1942 alone. Indeed, you can see here that patriotism and scholasticism are now ideologies placed around the reformists who are pro-kana, with the idea that these are the indigenous characters, that unlike continental characters, which of course here means kanji, they are something which aligns with, right, matches with Japanese expressions, different from imported ones, but also reflect the spiritualistic and idealistic imports of the Japanese expressions. Indeed, the paper even goes on to claim that it is not the Chinese written language, but Japanese kana, which conform to the cadence of racial emotions and sentiments. So the debate now is not just about the good of the Japanese nation, but which script is most in line with the Japanese spirit and the Japanese race. This is, of course, obviously also evoked in favor of kanji, such as in this article, which argues that calling kanji Chinese characters is wrong because words like koko have meaning that is different in Japan, and as a result, they are understood differently in Japan. Therefore, the words are peculiar Japanese, the loss of which is so much impoverishment of the Nipponese spirit permeating the words. Of course, changing your script does not mean losing words, right? That's a false argument. That's a false claim. If we wrote Japanese in hiragana, we wouldn't lose words. But the argument here, right, is that by changing a script, we're losing something Japanese. We're losing a Japanese essence. And Romaji, on the other hand, is now out. Romaji advocates are people who are under the spell of Western civilization, with the paper saying that it is gratifying to note that a movement has practically disappeared from the country. So in summary, throughout the first half of the Showa period, we see graphic ideologies continue to clash, but all in ways that support a more singular ideology of Japanese linguistic nationalism. On paper, these arguments are all fighting, but at the same time, they're reinforcing a singular ideology that the best script, the best way to write Japanese is the way which is most Japanese, and eventually the most Asian, with Japan being the path, the Japanese language and its representation being the path to which the Asiatic spirit is grasped. So rather than rising nationalism and government censorship causing the simple loss of debate over writing reform, we instead see the often overlooked diversity underlying how social actors use languages and their ideas about language to create and negotiate novel social context. Permissible framings of reform shrink much faster than permissible reform positions. Indeed, pro-Romanization continues until about 1936, but the idea that kanji or kana are barbaric or a legacy of a horrible past is no longer tenable. The arguments you can make become untenable much later than the ideologies you can bring about in support of these various arguments. So what happens then once we leave World War II? Well, we see that there are about 5 arguments a year, which seems less than before. But if we look at the chart, within 1945 1949, there's a huge amount of discussions of writing reform. We dropped to less than half in the 1950s, about little more than half of that in 1960s, and then down to 16 across 1970 1981. So if you're wondering why I ended my data set in 1981, part of the reason is that 1981 is when the Joyo kanji list was passed. So we entered a place where it's not finished, right? There have been kanji added or removed since then, but basically a pretty stable place in the history of Japanese writing reform. But also the data just dried up. And indeed, as we got to 1981, it was almost gone. So it looked like there was just nothing going to be there for the next few decades. The story was sort of done in a lot of ways. The paper moved quite quickly back to Romanization advocacy after the war. The first pro-Romaji piece comes out in 1945. It's a letter to the editor with a, quote, good suggestion. Why not change over to the use of Latin letters to express your written alphabet? The Japan Times itself then supports Romanization in 1946, stating that from our point of view, the reforms in question have little meaning unless the goal is the adoption of Romaji. Nationalism or links to Japan's past, etc., are now positioned as bad, and ideological arguments that position certain ways of writing Japanese as Japanese or nationalistic, militaristic, or linked to Japan's past are arguments against them, such as arguments against the Nippon Shiki romanization system, that it is favored by none except bigots, communists, and the Ministry of Education, or the idea that it is rooted in an ultra-nationalistic sentiment having its roots in Shinto mysticism. So that argument about sort of the paganistic idolatry, the nature worshiper being in the Japanese language that we haven't seen since the end of the Meiji period is back, along with the argument that it is now unpopular with modern Japanese. So a lot of revivals of ideologies that became very untenable after about 1920 and 1930. Indeed, anti-kanji arguments use these as well. In this sarcastic piece called You Can't Do It, which says just give up, don't reform your language, just give up on modernizing, it won't happen. So it's sarcastically being pro-kanji in order to promote romanization, argues that kanji have intricate dots that will choke your future and you will sacrifice yourself. And interestingly, bringing up some kind of indigenous, like nationalistic pro-Japanese arguments in a subtle way, saying that you're doing it for a script that isn't even yours, but it will bring you a cultural death almost more beautiful than that of the hieroglyph lovers of Egypt. Or this argument here that the enlightened people curse Chinese characters as a cancer, and then go into the quote-unquote practical argument that it causes eyesight damage. However, after 1950, the paper warms towards kanji. We go from 3 pro-kanji pieces to 9, about 2 more every decade. Now, that's not a huge increase, right? That's only 6 total. It is 3 to 9 is not a huge difference in the grand scheme of things. But when we think about how many articles there are, that's 3 out of over 100, so less than 3%, to 9 out of 17. So more than 50% of the pieces in the 1970s are explicitly pro-kanji. Indeed, we can see a lot of inversions of the arguments we've seen so far, starting about 1959. So here you can see the paper claiming that all pro-Romanization was done under duress or the threat of the death penalty, stating that replacing Japanese with a phonetic alphabet would be confusing and create a loss of contact with the cultural heritage of the nation. Indeed, by 1968, the Japan Times is now claiming that reformists are radicals and that Romanization is a radical change. Now, it is absolutely true that the American occupation censored Japanese press. That's correct. But as you've seen through this very presentation, this framing ignores the full-throated advocacy of the Japan Times from about 1890 to about 1936, where it was very much pro-Romanization without, American government censorship. So the history here is kind of being rewritten in favor of an ideology that claims that only radicals were pro-Romanization. This is actually, in terms of numbers, not exactly incorrect, but it is surprising for a paper that was very much pro-Romanization. One of the most extreme inversions that we can see is in this editorial from 1981, which takes the currently quite rare position that Romanization is good, right? Romanization is something that we should be in favor of. This spawns a huge backlash in terms of letters to the editor, with one inverting many of the framings we've seen so far, claiming that anyone who has mastered the Japanese language, so the idea that if you are an authority of Japanese, you are good, right? Like you are in favor of the same thing I'm in favor of, that we saw a long time ago is now in favor of kanji, understands that you cannot slice away at the very roots and branches of spoken and written Japanese by removing kanji. Indeed, why be chained to Romaji, an even less lengthier and less meaningful writing system, when kanji is in fact the key to unlocking the Japanese language? And this, of course, written by someone who is not Japanese. So we're seeing that there's a huge diversity of ideologies, with some of the ones that we've seen support one script quite easily being modified to support another as we change over time. So in conclusion, what we're seeing here is that throughout the history of the Japan Times, the paper has primarily stood as an advocate of writing reform, especially full Hepburn Romanization. That said, it does gradually succumb to government control, moving to pro-kana and then just pro-kanji, although after World War II, it goes back to Romanization and then repudiates this position as being done under duress. More importantly, though, that we're seeing that it was not simply the positions that the Japan Times supported which changed over time, but rather the very framing of individual scripts was constantly in flux in a way that reflects and clarifies individual connections between language use and power structures throughout Japan's history of written reform. For example, right after Japan reopened to the world, the question of which script was most Japanese was initially not important. Rather, links to Japan's past are even framed negatively, such as kanji being a part of a barbarous nature-worshipping past. As we approach the Second World War, though, all scripts, including contrasting styles of romanization, end up framed as patriotic or Japanese by their supporters, and then non-Japanese by their opponents, as debates respond to changing power structures and consequent understandings of cultural nationalism in Japan. The debates over which script ultimately all work together to reinforce a sense of Japaneseness, and the idea that the script that is most Japanese and the writing style which is most Japanese and authentically Japanese, unadulterated, is the best, the one that will best reflect the Japanese spirit, the Japanese nation, or even align to the inherent nature of the Japanese race as it is framed in these papers. So advocates for script currently now seen as not Japanese, such as romanization, inverted their responding to reframe and participate in these nationalist dialogues to assure readers, which eventually included literal government censors, that their disagreement over how to best write Japanese did not reflect disagreement with the nation-state authorized representations of truth and morality that are often entwined in our major linguistic dialogues. So coverage of writing and script policy throughout the Japan Times is therefore an important cultural site for watching how Japanese ideologies about morality, national identities, and the indexical values of graphic language use became inextricably intertwined, with the constantly mutating framings throughout its pages evidencing how the socially situated nature of all representations of language turned discourse of the best way to write Japanese not just into discourse of which system best matches Japanese phonetics, or which system best matches Japanese grammar, or what will allow us to read the stuff that we've written in the past, or which script is most efficient for typewriters, but rather discourse over the past, future, and soul of Japan itself. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found this interesting. If you allow me to end with a bit of really blatant self-promotion, if you'd like to know more about my research in general, please follow me on Twitter or check out my blog, where I regularly do kind of casual language resources and updates on the Japanese language. Also, my book, which looks at language ideologies influencing the use of hiragana, katakana, and kanji in contemporary Japan, is coming out in paperback. So it's going from a completely unreasonable price to a just fairly unreasonable price. So I hope that makes it a bit more accessible. And if you'd like to learn more about language ideologies in general, I also have a podcast which looks at language ideologies and language in the extreme metal scene called Lingua Brutalica. We're available on Spotify, Podbean, and YouTube, as well as Twitter. So please check us out if you're keen. Again, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. And I hope I'll be back with some more videos for you soon. Take care.